今天一大早来到这边呢，非常荣幸哈。我想简单的开场白了哈。今天的座谈会还是 symposium 还是以 English 为主哈。那我简单的开场白哈。那我想呢，非常荣幸啊。今天呢，各位好朋友呢，10点半来到我们 TIA 的 International Symposium 啊。我们这个主题呢非常的重要啊。美台中的战略平衡。我想呢，这个关乎于现在整个地缘政治、整个全球秩序的重组了哈。我简单的介绍一下我们2位的 panelist 啊。The first speaker is Mr. Stephen Yes，OK 那 Stephen Yes 呢，他是现在在传统基金会的资深研究员资历非常显赫，曾经当过 Dick Cheney 美国的副总统的副国安顾问。那我想呢，在政府部门工作过的他呢，想必对很多的实务的政策是有很深的了解。那比较特别的是说，他在19岁那一年，他有3年的时间在台湾，以摩门教的这个传教士走遍整个台东到台南、高雄，甚至到中部。我想呢，有几个有趣的事情啊。第一个就是说他对于这个台湾的一些东西呢，他呢首先勇敢的吃了我们台湾的皮蛋，因为那是一个 break， 所以他说他非常的勇敢的吃了它，而且觉得非常好吃，对不对？然后他说走到哪里大家都会用美食来喂他，他觉得台湾交朋友的方式就是美食。另外呢，我有看到一个比较特别的，就是说他对于台湾的乩童跟庙会非常的印象深刻，所以呢，他的儿子呢也公开说 so cool， 非常的这个，所以呢，另外呢，他在当摩门教的传教士的时候呢，他对于恒春的落山风非常的 powerful seasonal winds， 非常的有感，因为他说这个必须把这个脚踏车呢往下的时候，2只脚要踏在地上，所以呢，这个我想。另外呢，在我们的前总统李登辉那时候呢，非常的喜欢他。他说，李登辉说他是台湾阿辉，台湾的阿辉，然后这个是 America's 阿辉，美国的阿辉啦。那当然呢，上一次对台湾最大的贡献就是说，他在2016年呢，促成了我们这个蔡英文总统跟这个川普的这个通话了哈。所以我们今天非常的荣幸请到他。他最近的言论里面有针对郑丽文的这个要去访美见习近平他说这个非常的 ridiculous 非常的荒谬。因为呢，郑丽文的立场不代表国民党内部的人。另外呢，郑丽文本身的观点也只是台湾的少数。重点是郑丽文在做的事情不符合美国的国家利益。美国是以国防作为优先。另外他呢在帮助中国 divide and 这个 shred Taiwan， 所以说呢，这是不符合美国利益的。那我想今天呢，他来开讲的，应该我们的这个启发会非常多。另外一位呢，也是我们的好朋友陈芳瑜副教授，大家都认识他了上次跟郑丽文呢一言一答呢，这个占据了新闻。然后呢，我们的陈教授呢，当然呢，他在政治系里面是负责威权政治、民主化、政治行为，当然还有美台中三角关系。本身呢，也一直在参与台湾的公民社会的运动。所以对于美台中我比较喜欢讲美台中了甚至有时候会讲台美中这个三角关系呢也非常有这个贡献。我想呢，我们就开始今天的这个 symposium。我想第一部分我们会先请我的 Mr. 就是 America's 阿慧先来讲这个大概20 minutes， 就是所谓的20分钟的演讲。接下来呢，我们再请我们的陈教授呢讲大概10分钟。接下来的第3部分就是请我们的陈教授呢，你来提问我们的 Stephen Yet。最后我们会开放时间，让现场的观众呢来发问。好，我想我们就以最热烈的掌声来欢迎我们的美国阿辉。
Thank you very much， 各位爱台湾的朋友，大家好。That's all the Taiwanese I will speak. But I just want to thank you very much for being here this morning and for allowing me to come. In Japan, in the summertime, they have a policy that they call cool biz, that at a certain point, they want the air conditioning to be set at a higher temperature so that it saves energy, and so you don't wear a jacket or a tie. And I would like to support that, but out of respect to you, I wore a coat and tie to show that I deeply respect your good work. So there's an old saying that I took with me in my heart that I learned in the Taiwan countryside, waking up studying classical Chinese, but going out and talking to people in Taiwan. It was 吃得苦中苦，方为人上人. So right now I'm 吃苦, wearing this suit. But I just want to thank you for your love of Taiwan, your openness to friendship and cooperation with the United States. My lifetime has been spent in this conversation, and it's been a great blessing to me. Next year marks 40 years from the first time I arrived in Taiwan, and I was told that I was going to see the real China, and how lucky I was in the Cold War to come and see the real China. And then I was sent first to Zhanghua, but couldn't understand anything. And then after 2 months, I was sent to Taidong, and I had to report to the police to move from one city to another in Taiwan. So I took my Juliu Zheng and some passport photos so the policeman could laugh at the American, giving his photos over. And the policeman asked me, "Would you please teach me Japanese?" And I said, "Look at me, why would you expect that I could teach you Japanese?" And he said, "Well, I'm from Taipei, and I don't speak Taiwanese, and I don't speak Ame, and so what language most of these people speak is Taiwanese or Japanese, so can you help me learn Japanese?" He said, "The missionary before you could help me learn Japanese." I said, "His name was Sato. Of course he could help you learn Japanese." But that was my first awakening, that coming to Taiwan, I was not going to see the real China. I was having an entry-level course in learning about the real Taiwan, and that most of American policy and expertise was built on the opposite model of thinking more in the mind of Chiang Kai-shek or from opening to China, and then they have a somewhat narrower understanding of organically what realities of Taiwan were. And most of my career has been spent sometimes fighting with other Americans, but usually trying to be kinder and persuasive, but I'm not always successful, in trying to help people understand that I believe that American policy is strongest and most resilient when it's based on the truth. When it's based on imagination, that is like in the Bible where it talks about a house built on sand or a house built on rock. And the fantasy or imagination of what things might become, that's sand. But if you begin with rock and truth, then Taiwan is Taiwan. Everyone calls it Taiwan. Even the communists call it Taiwan. And it's only in other fantasies where it becomes Chinese Taipei, and where I lived 2 years of my life was not in Taipei, not even a single day. And a lot of the people I met weren't Chinese. And so I have been an advocate for trying to get Americans to speak more clearly and to understand some of these realities to inform what our policy is. That doesn't mean that Americans will recognize independence for Taiwan or that it will support unification with China. It just means that we're going to begin with what is, and then we can talk about what makes sense from our national interest about what could be and how those processes should work. Now, I've spent 40 years in that conversation, and we can judge in 2026 that I have been very unsuccessful in trying to get the critical mass of the leadership level of our country to talk this way. From time to time we have. And I think under President Trump we have some opportunities, but also some challenges in that. If you just watched what President Trump said riding the plane home from meeting with Xi Jinping, he said that the 6 assurances were a long time ago. And that's true. And I think that a lot of American leaders need to understand that whatever we had for reasons of policy 40 and 50 years ago, the world has changed, the United States has changed, China has changed, technology has changed. I don't know that those policies are sufficient for what we are dealing with now. And if we keep doing things the way we've always done them, then we will remain in a perpetual state of crisis and risk management. And that hasn't put the United States in the best possible position, and that's why President Trump felt he had a mandate to rebalance some elements of the economic relationship, to try to make us more self-reliant in key industries, to try to make the trade relationship with China more fair. All of the presidents I had been around in the past wanted those things, but they didn't change any of the structure of the United States in order to be able to accomplish those things. And so I at least see some positives in what President Trump is trying to do. Whether he is successful or not, history will judge. But I think some of these things that he is trying to do, frankly, are what Democrats talked about doing in the United States in the 1990s. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have in US-China relations, US-Taiwan relations, and cross-strait relations is that there is an overemphasis on the personalities involved and not enough of the rock part of this, which is the systems that we're dealing with. And some of those systems are changing, and we need to focus more on that than the personalities and words. It doesn't make any difference if President Trump goes to China and he goes to Zhongnanhai and Xi Jinping, as if he's some kind of a forestry major, is walking around saying this tree is 150 years old and this tree is 400 years old. That has nothing to do with the fact that the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, conducted a revolution against all of the olds when they made that revolution, and they literally called it Xinhua, which means not deep classical Chinese, it literally means New China, which meant it's against all the old China. Its government organ is called Xinhua She. And so it doesn't get to claim the olds if it killed people in order to establish New China. And by the way, if you want to see old trees, you can go to California and see some genuinely tall old trees. It doesn't make America any different. It's going to celebrate a 250th birthday. That's older than the People's Republic of China. And by the way, President Trump is older than the People's Republic of China. And so we have, I think, an over-focus on the individuals. China does a very good job of political warfare and information manipulation. And so the first presidential interactions that I saw, not as a high-level participant, was very early in my career. I was an intelligence liaison officer to the Commerce Department. And it's when the Clinton administration was moving away from the sanctions based on human rights and going back to what was called engagement. And they were going to have a whole delegation of high-level CEOs to go to China. And President Clinton went on his morning jog by the Commerce Department to welcome the CEO of General Motors and a number of others to launch then Secretary Ron Brown's visit to China to open up the market. And I don't know if that starts to sound similar to you, but we just had a president go and bring CEOs, and the core message was to open the market. Well, this is how many years since Nixon's opening? How many years since Reform and Open Up? How many years since President Clinton pivoted away from the butchers of Beijing and towards engagement and opening? How many years since the integration of China into the WTO? And we're still trying some of the same things. That, I think, is a problem. That is the sand. That is the dream. And I think a challenge for people in Taiwan and friends in America is how do we encourage our leaders to do things and say things based on realities. I personally consider Xi Jinping to be a very different kind of leader of China. It's not that Jiang Zemin was a nice guy. Personally, I thought Hu Jintao was dead boring. But it didn't mean that he also didn't persecute Christians, persecute Uyghurs, persecute Tibetans, and continue China's military modernization in ways that were a challenge to our allies and to Taiwan. But I think Xi Jinping has done things that are more aggressive and more open than his predecessors did. In a way, that is a blessing. to Taiwan and to the United States. And the reason I say that is because it's one thing if China fundamentally, those tectonic plates are moving in a certain direction, but we're not paying attention. And we have people giving us a soothing scenario that everything's going to be okay. Technology is so strong, and we're trading so much money, and we're investing so much money that they're going to grow inevitably in different directions, and our differences will narrow, and our cooperation will expand. And all of the global problems, if we're going to solve them, we need cooperation with China. So if they say they're going to cooperate, then all of a sudden we're not noticing that the fundamental tectonic plates are moving in a direction where our investment in them was used to acquire the capabilities to threaten our interests in ways that are many, many multiples greater than when we began the experiment. And my main criticism against the establishment way of thinking about China and dealing with China and facing this challenge is not making the bet in the past. Americans inherently are driven by a missionary impulse and a commercial impulse and want to be optimistic about engaging the world and converting the world to our way of thinking and doing things. That could be good, maybe it's not good, but it is what it is, and it's been pretty much the case for now coming up on 250 years. But that way of thinking, the problem is if the business returns don't give you the evidence that you're getting the return on that investment, that you're getting the measurable change in behavior, then it is actually a sin not to change course. And I think that in both major political parties in the United States, there has been somewhat of an awakening, but that's courtesy of Xi Jinping. Even in Europe, we have struggled to get more Europeans to see the challenge the way we do, that national security and economic security are linked, that you cannot be economically dependent on a country that is fueling a war of aggression against your region of the world. And that's what Europe is seeing, that China is fueling a war of aggression that's fundamentally challenging Europe, and yet they remain very, very dependent, oddly, on both Russia and China. And so we're in these periods of transition. Who has been driving the change? It's really kind of been Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping took very aggressive actions against American companies, including American executives. When you tell an American executive that you can't leave the country when you've chosen to leave the country, or that your assets may be called into question, when you take the global financial hub that was Hong Kong and you fundamentally change the nature of the reality in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, that has commercial consequences to how business leaders begin to see what's happening. It's under Xi Jinping that Taiwan's outbound investment went from 80% going to China to export back to the American market, among others, to now only 3% of your outbound investment going to China. That isn't because Taiwan said we don't like China. Back in the 1980s, I was listening to Taiwanese people tell me how suspicious they were of China, that genetically Taiwanese people were different from Chinese people. I heard all of the stories about how everything was different. The only thing that changed recently was the treatment of Taiwan business and investment on the mainland, the taking of technology and brands, and then pushing that out. And that trend has begun with Japan, where now they say that you just want independence. They say Japan wants to remilitarize, and America just wants to impose hegemony. But in every one of these examples, it's psychological projection of this is what the Communist Party is doing, of pushing out its power to impose its will on its near abroad, to engage in negotiations, which I don't blame them for, to seek advantage. I blame us for not being wise about what they're trying to do and coming up with effective counters. But the good news part of it is, because Xi Jinping poisoned, at a conservative estimate, 500,000 Americans with fentanyl, because he killed over 1 million Americans with COVID. And people, for political reasons, were fighting about where did it come from and all of that. But now it's not even in dispute that they were the origin, and that they lied, and those lies had consequences that took trillions of dollars out of the global economy and millions of lives away from this existence. That's not a normal country with whom you can have normal negotiations and normal diplomatic relations. And slowly, we're having our leaders adjust to it. President Trump has adjusted more to it than any of his predecessors, but it's still a work in progress. He still wants to have a deal that, in his estimation, would stabilize and make more resilient the US and China economic competition. I don't oppose that objective as a principle, but I also think that there are other very big priorities besides just getting that economic relationship rebalanced. And I fundamentally have a very skeptical view that Xi Jinping will deliver on any agreement any more than Putin is delivered on the promised ceasefire with Ukraine, or that the non-status quo actors in Gaza are going to honor a ceasefire, or that the remnants of the Iranian regime are going to come and make an agreement that we can count on being implemented. I think this is just the reality of what those kind of systems are. We still try. We try to build up guardrails against bad outcomes, but this is what I think the project of the US, Taiwan, China triangle is now. With Taiwan, you have a challenge. Your elected leader is branded heavily by Xi Jinping and the global media that they try to influence. They have social media assets that are able to reach audiences that the formal communist media system wouldn't be able to. And they are trying to label William Lai as a troublemaker that is just an echo of Chen Shui-bian. And so they're trying to say that you are trying to drive toward independence, and President Lai is stuck here saying, I can't drive to a place I already am. So it's not that I'm driving somewhere, I am telling you this is where we are, and if they want to change it, well, that needs to be peaceful, not by coercion, and it needs to be met with the assent of my people that I was elected to represent. That's not a troublemaker, that's not driving, that's a system trying to talk to a system. Obviously, the communist system doesn't accept those terms, and it's behaving in a different way. The US system is struggling with how to interact with that communist system and this democratic system and still be able to avoid a crisis that it feels is more than the system can bear right now, in part because of your own success. And this is where I will end my opening. Hopefully this opening is okay with you, but we can have more of an interaction with all of you to get into specific questions. But in part, Taiwan's own success is what brings us to this conversation now in a fundamentally different way. It's not just TSMC. Although TSMC is almost the wealthiest sovereign nation in a company on the planet at this point. And in some ways, your government probably feels like TSMC operates like a separate government too. But because of the value of that technology and that company and its global footprint, because your stock market is one of the most valuable on this planet now, in no small part because of TSMC and the ecosystem around it, but also some others. And because you now have Xi Jinping picking just as much of a fight with Japan and the Philippines as he has with Taiwan, it is undermining the argument that it's just because of politics here that we have the risk of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. And now you have allies of the United States under treaty, but also friends of Taiwan in Japan and the Philippines talking more about the first island chain, having a shared interest in freedom of navigation, having a shared concern about the aggressive claims and actions by the People's Republic of China being the non-status quo actor. And if those countries and governments together can have coordinated communication with the United States about, we want to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. We want America to lead the way on semiconductors, AI, space, win the future, because we live next to China and we have invested in China. But for our 2 generations of generous investment in China, the thanks we get is a threat to our sovereignty and a threat to our companies. And so we need to stand together for peace and prosperity, but we want to do that as the best, most reliable friends of the United States, and we hope that the United States will be the best, most reliable friend to us. We only get there if you ignore the personalities, because I can guarantee that just as all of you have a cartoon image of our current president, there are lots of Americans that have a cartoon image of our president. But ultimately, what matters is policy and action, much, much more. And if we can get those things right with Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and some others, including the Pax Silica Alliance structure in technology, and we get more movements to be stronger, more resilient, and have better supply chain management from the United States, then the leverage that Beijing had to threaten a crisis is more manageable, is safer. And I think we've got a better path forward. So with that, I'll stop the opening remarks. I've probably gone over my 20 minutes. For that, I apologize. But again, thank you for letting me come and share some thoughts that don't represent the president of any country, and maybe don't even represent what can happen. But I have lived a long time and dealt with a lot of these people for a long time, and I do believe that this is food for thought that I would encourage all of you to take on board, and I welcome your critique of my humble presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for your opening. I think everyone here is highly interested and also pay a lot of attention on the U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. And because we love Taiwan, because we love democracy, because we share a lot of the common values, especially freedom. So I think we should talk more about this because we have seen the rise of the authoritarian diffusion, so that we have to understand more about the dictatorships. So first of all, I want to echo some of your points here. So firstly, domestic politics. So we have seen that, you just mentioned that, for example, the drug issues, and the drugs are mostly from China. So we also see in Taiwan recently, there are a lot of the drug issue, the drug driving issue, and because of that, and most of that, the drugs are from China as well. And then because of our chaos in the late, it become very difficult for us to implement some of our policies and also to prevent the drugs issues there. So we do have some common difficulties as well. So a lot of the difficulties are coming from China. So yeah, so we have to think of it and how to these problems. So domestic issues. I think China is now utilizing the democratic systems, not only in the US, but also in Taiwan, because, well, for China, I think that China is now delaying some of the talks with the US since last year, because they have apparently are waiting for the results of the midterm elections in the US. So you can see that from last year, China just sent a lot of the low-level officials to talk with the U.S. and then just trying to delay all of the, the talks with the U.S. So as a democracies, we have to the strategy of the to think of some of the ways to respond. And secondly, I think one of the most important point Steve makes is that the structure. I mean, the structure of the U.S.-China relations, there are some of the changes and continuities there. So the structures for the great power competition is that China is now trying to challenge the U.S., trying to change the world. We call it a rule-based international order. So that is the structure, and the structure will be constant. There will be no change. So even though sometimes China is trying to be nice, I mean, sometimes Xi Jinping is trying to say, oh, we want free trade, we want to expand relations, but the structure will not change. I mean, the goals will always be that China is now challenging the world order, the rule-based order. So that is a constant we have to pay attention to. And also, Steve points that Xi Jinping and all of the dictators will not comply with any international agreements. That is also that Taiwanese people and also democracies, democratic countries should pay attention. So the dictators, their ambitions will never stop. Okay, so that is what we have to fight for. We have to find out some strategy to respond to. Okay. Okay. So and also the structure is that for the great power competitions between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and China is now have a slow decouple with. So let me give you some of the numbers here since the beginning of the trade war. Thank you. Thank you. So since the beginning of the trade war in 2018, the U.S. The trade volume between U.S. and China has been decreased from 600 billion U.S. dollars to 400 billions last year. So it is 1/3 of the decrease since the trade war. So, but still a lot. I mean, 400 billion US dollars between the two countries are still a very large trade volume. So the implication is that the US and China is trying to decouple with each other, but they cannot cut off the linkage in a short time. So we can expect that the US and China is now trying to do this kind of what we call a 斗而不破. So conflict without direct military or a larger conflict. So 斗而不破. So there will be a continuation for in a expected period of time. So and also in this period of time, Taiwan and the U.S. become a major trading partner. So since last decades, Taiwan and the U.S. The number is that. Trade volume between Taiwan and U.S. become increase from 67 to 250 billion. Okay, so it's a huge increase. So it's 4 times of the increase from Taiwan to the U.S. And now trade with U.S. account for about 90% of our trade surplus in Taiwan. And that is an advantage, also a disadvantage for Taiwan, because we know that Mr. Trump cares about the trade surplus and the deficit, right? So we have to persuade very hard with a U.S. partner that, become a partner. We have a lot of trade surplus. It is because the U.S. and Taiwan are now partners in order to, advance our technologies, especially the AI industry, in order to compete with China. So that this trade surplus is fine. Okay, so we have to persuade the U.S. about this. And then I also want to briefly talk about there's a rise of the so-called U.S. skepticism now in Taiwan, and the U.S. skepticism is evolving. So what do I mean by evolving is that since the beginning of the trade war several years ago, the U.S. skepticism is all about the Taiwan's self-defense determinants. So 7 or 8 years ago, the U.S. skepticism is all about, the U.S. is declining, and then China is rising, so that we have to rely more on China, to pick a side on China instead of the U.S., and the U.S. will going to abandon Taiwan. That is a major element of the U.S. skepticism several years ago in the first Trump administration. And then in the in the Biden administration, we see there's a continuation of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Also, there was a breakout of the Ukraine war. So the U.S. skepticism becoming that, it is U.S. fault that caused all of the conflicts all over the world. So it is a major involvement of the U.S. skepticism now in Taiwan. And after the Ukraine war, everything becomes U.S. fault. It is the U.S. that irritates Russians. It is a NATO expansion that irritates the bigger countries. So that the implication for Taiwan is that, Taiwan should not anger China. So the U.S. skepticism become something like this. And now we have seen that China's ambition and also China's confidence on challenging the U.S. has been increasing, not decreasing. So even though the China's economic condition is now in a very bad shape, but still their confidence of challenging the U.S. is still just keeping rising. So we can see that the budget-wise, China just pour in a lot more resource on their defense budget, also on developing their arms. So. We should understand that China is expanding on their military, but also on their narratives. So their narratives and also their propaganda becoming even more stronger in this year. So in Taiwan, we also see that because Mr. Trump has been in his second term, so we should be very familiar with his style and languages. We should know that a lot of the U.S. and China and Taiwan relations are just very stable, I think. But sometimes, because of the language or some of the so-called transactional approaches, so there's a rising, the U.S. skepticism becoming rising. So sometimes when Mr. Trump or some of the officials will say something, and then the U.S. skepticism or China will utilize this to confuse people, to say that, oh, the U.S. will abandon Taiwan or something like that again. So just as I said, we should understand more about the structure. So the U.S.-China competition will be constant. So there will be no change on this. But in the short term, the U.S. and China there are something that the two sides are interdependent on each other. For example, the rare earths China is now weaponizing the rare earths, and for the democratic countries, the democratic alliances, it is very difficult to just get rid of this reliance on the rare earths from China in the short term. So there's no reason that the U.S. and China just break out, go into the direct conflict this moment. So there will be something we call as a détente, or a slow conflict in a expected area of expected period of time. So, but now the U.S. skepticism will say that, oh, the U.S. is not going to compete with China, or then Taiwan will be abandoned. Something like that will rise again. So overall, I think that we have to be informed about everything, and we should inform people. For people like us from the policy circle, we always study U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. We should inform people, and then the people should maybe just get understanding about all of this structure, and then to understand more about the U.S. And also, the most important thing of all is that we should understand more about the dictatorship, because the dictatorship is now having a lot of danger in our democratic world. So that is, I'll just stop here. Thank you. So so let me ask you some questions. So the first question is, I want to ask is about the Secretary of State Marco Rubio's interview in Beijing. So he said that, oh, now the priority of China is to make Taiwanese people willingly and just join China by vote or some form. So what is your take on this interview?
Well, I have believed for a time that is basically what China's preferred approach is. Over the years, I have been involved in engagement with the People's Republic of China, and sometimes banned from being able to go to the People's Republic of China. So sometimes they'll say that I am very ignorant of them. I say, well, you don't let me go visit you, so I don't know what your complaint is. But the reality is that China knows to a certain degree that the Taiwanese people are a very bitter pill to swallow. The Taiwanese people were a Japanese colony for 50 years and came out with their own identity. Taiwanese people were under martial law for 25 years and came out with their own identity. And so at some level of rationality, the Central Party school has to know that they can hurt Taiwan, but to actually hold and control Taiwan, you're a crazy people to try to control. And the Japanese had to give up at some point, partly because of a little bit of a war. But even the very powerful control of the KMT martial law had to pull back and erode at some point. And this very different identity has emerged. And so I think if you take that rationality, and back in the 1990s when I did have freedom to go back and forth until I said some complimentary things about Lee Teng-hui, and then they said I was so ignorant of history and there was no point in having dialogue with someone like me, and so I was welcome to go to the airport, but I wouldn't be allowed to leave the airport. So I wasn't technically banned, but I couldn't go. But during those time of interaction, I would go talk to people in the Chinese countryside, and they were very happy to talk and engage. They didn't care about Taiwan. Taiwan was little and far away. Why do I care about that? I want hospital. I want the school to be strong. I want these roads and bridges to be reliable. I want my government to stop being corrupt. And they were very open and direct about it, even though they knew as soon as the Laowai left the neighborhood that the security people were going to come and say, what did you tell to the Laowai? But they were very bold and direct about that in the 1990s. And I think that to a degree, a lot of Chinese people still think along these lines, but there is a much more militant enforcement about who says what to foreigners now, and they have a much more advanced surveillance system of who's going where and saying what, that I think that there is a more uniform version of this conversation happening now. But underneath it all, I still think that that's the basis of what Secretary Rubio is saying. They know that they can hurt Taiwan, but they have a very hard time actually taking this territory and holding this territory. And so in that, they would much rather use divide and conquer as a means to get Taiwan isolated enough and pressured enough that some political grouping in Taiwan relents and makes a deal. Not unlike, in some ways, what the United States is trying to impose upon Iran at the current time. And that Iran scenario is, I think, the most challenging scenario for Taiwan to now try to contemplate. We've had the Gulf War scenarios in the times past. We've had other kinds of scenarios. There's the Russia-Ukraine scenario, which might give you some hope about adapting technology. You can be the smaller power in some numbers, but still be able to resist, and you should believe and invest in those things. But the Iran scenario is probably closer to what China has in mind to try. Some form of blockade, some form of decapitation, some form of pressure and isolation so that you relent. And I think that is a more direct version of what Secretary Rubio might have been talking about. Now, you have options that Iran doesn't have. You have real neighbors who care about this outcome, who are treaty allies of the United States. That means more than nothing. The Strait of Hormuz is something that's affected global markets, and it affected your market to a degree. But the global shipping traffic around Taiwan accounts for about 50% of total global container shipping for trade. That, you add the market crash onto the goods and services that would be affected by a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, and it's several orders of magnitude bigger than what the world has been dealing with in the Straits of Hormuz. At some level, we have rational capitals in the world that will resist that. And they might not like it, but they will have to come to the defense of Taiwan because Japan has it as a national interest. The Philippines is now more open about it being in a national interest. The status quo is freedom of navigation, and Taiwan being Taiwan, and China not being able to use overwhelming force to change the definition of that status quo. We are so invested and so interdependent on that side of things in a way that's larger than our commercial goods dependence on China, that reality has to come into play. But I think that is what Secretary Rubio was alluding to. But that means that we need to be smarter in democratic societies about the nature of political warfare. We are not very smart or good at that. The authoritarians make it a priority. And for the CCP, it is their #1 priority, that by winning an information war, everything that is downstream from that can fall into place. And sometimes it works. But I think that's what he was getting at and what the nature of the challenge is for us now starkly.
Thank you. So I have two related questions. The first one is that there's a consensus in the U.S. on the Taiwan issue. Is it still strong? So recently we have seen that, for example, the Speaker Mike Johnson and also the Trade Representative Mr. Greer and also many high-level officials in the U.S. will say something about Taiwan, and then we have seen a very strong support for Taiwan security. And also some people even mention that the Taiwan independence is very important. For example, Mike Johnson. So is there still a consensus there? And also, the related question is that, because you mentioned that there are some of the long-term policies that need to be adjusted, but sometimes we have also seen some of the long-term principles. For example, the Taiwan Relations Act, and also the Six Assurances, there's still some principles there that lasted for a long time. So how do you see there's some of the changes there, and it's still a consensus for all of these foundations of the U.S.-Taiwan relations?
Well, thank you. I'll first try to deal with the consensus issue and then try to deal with the principles or established structures. And remind me if I forget, because I'm getting older and I sometimes forget. But on the, what was the first part? See, I already forgot. No, consensus. It was a bad joke, sorry. The consensus part, it's a little bit true and a little bit false. You can never afford to assume that this consensus holds. You have a large number of members of the House of Representatives in the United States that belong to a Taiwan caucus. That's fine. It's good that they have a caucus. It's good that they say friendly things about Taiwan. And it's a forum that when Taiwan leaders come and visit, they can engage members of this caucus and talk about economic opportunity, cultural support, generally good things. But never mistake a caucus for being action or policy. They don't make decisions about arms sales. They don't make decisions about whether your leader is allowed to visit the United States and under what circumstances and under what names and whatever else. They're just a caucus. And this consensus in America, well, it's as strong as sensibility dominates our politics. And we live in a particularly insane period of politics where the most lunatic people in American politics get the most attention. And they will go on to podcasts. I have some podcasts. I'm not disrespecting podcasts, but they go on to certain podcasts that will say very shocking things because they make money in those podcasts with shocking things. It's sort of what we used to have in radio in America, and we literally called them shock jocks. That their job was to entertain and to make people angry, and then that engagement would lead to advertising revenue. It's what social media is largely designed to do now because there is steep science behind. If you are angry, you're likely to stay on that social media site longer. You're likely to interact more, and it gives more opportunity for me to pump advertising into your feed, and I can sell that advertising for more money to my sponsors. And so in our politics, we have the same feedback loop that if someone says something shocking or angering or doomer-like, that will get a lot of attention. And so in both parties, we have some voices that are out there. Now, I've picked a side. All of you know that I am biased. And I'm not here to convert you one way or the other, except I'm right, and you should believe me. But you have to know that that consensus is not supported by the people who are out there trying to say that one foreign country is taking over the foreign policy of the United States of America. That's not a rational conversation. It's also not a part of the party on the other side that is trying to talk about basically the absence of sovereignty, no borders, and trying to have sort of a degree of tolerance that is, as one famous author from Canada calls, suicidal empathy. That you are so concerned about being tolerant that you're opening yourself up to things that are suicidally damaging to your communities, your country, the fabric of your country, of your society. And so we have some extremes, and those extremes are on what this consensus can rest. Your job is to find ways to ignore some of those extremes and to try to reinforce the idea of why there might be consensus, why people on both sides of America's political divide should share an end objective that Taiwan should be Taiwan, that Taiwan is a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. But you probably need to change some of how you talk about who you are and what the value proposition is, It can't be the old story. The old story won't work. It's not just because you're a democracy. That should be good, but either of the parties. There's still a broad consensus that began in the middle of the last decade that was skeptical about sending American troops abroad for long-term engagements. It was skeptical about promising to defend those who were not willing to invest to defend themselves. And now, Taiwan is investing more, Japan is investing more, Korea is investing more. Even a reluctant and I think a little bit messed up Europe is beginning to see that they need to do more, and they're committing and doing a little bit more. So those things are changing, but the old justification for the consensus won't work. I still think that Taiwan contributes much more to America's prosperity and way of life than Taiwan makes clear to American audiences. And Taiwan can still contribute even more if it chooses. Taiwan could be vital to America becoming the semiconductor superpower of the next generation. So instead of fighting over whether the president says you stole the semiconductor industry, don't fight. Just talk about you love America and you would love to be a part of helping America be the next semiconductor superpower for the next generation. And so be sort of a little bit Taoist and a little bit Stoic combined. Don't get wound around what you cannot change and cannot control. Emphasize what you can change and can control. And what you can change is how you project what your value-added proposition is to the American people and to our national interest in ways that make it clear you're part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And frankly, your leader can do some of these things too. Beijing has done a very, very effective job of trying to say that your president is a troublemaker and that is what's trying to change the status quo. And the Chinese theater is very, very effective in trying to scare Americans when they come to visit. They get our ambassador will have like 20 ministers of state coming and say, oh no, this Taiwan situation is very, very serious. And this is the most sensitive and most important issue for China. Empirically, it is logical impossibility that anything related to Taiwan is the single most important issue for the leader of China. They have much, much more important issues that they have to deal with, but they have chosen for this to be the highlight, and it scares interlocutors when they go. And so President Trump will go, but every president before him would go and get the same kind of things. Wow, these Chinese leaders are really worked up about this. We need to get these guys to cool it. Cool what? Was Taiwan launching missiles into the Taiwan Strait? Was Taiwan blockading Macau or Hong Kong or Shanghai? Or was Taiwan saying that we wanted to absorb China? Was Taiwan trying to kick China out of international organizations? No, it's crazy. But you have to figure out how do you use what you can to communicate strategically to change how people see that value proposition. And I would argue in 2026, you have more to work with than you think, but you have to work harder than you have in previous generations to get the result that would be best for you. And I will try to do my part, not because I like you, you're likable enough, but I think it's important for my own country and for my own country's interests to see these things more clearly.
Let's turn to the floor. Okay. From here.
I have a question. Okay. I want to know. Okay, I have a question about Rubio, the role in the future. We know leadership is everything, okay? And then Rubio talked about, frankly, a lot about he's not in favor of communist. He's not in favor of communist country, China. And Trump always said, as long as I'm in the office, your Taiwan's safe. I'd like to know from your point of view on the role of Rubio. And then would he have a possible, good chance to be the candidate for the presidency next year? We live in Los Angeles, so we are more aware of the United States, yeah.
Well, if you live in Los Angeles, first you should elect Pratt mayor of Los Angeles. That will be the beginning of things changing. Of course, I have no magical crystal ball to say who is going to be the nominee and who's going to win the next election. I have a fun pattern that I have used just because most of my and going to Taiwan over all these decades, and every single free election in Taiwan, if the KMT won, then the Democrats won in America. And if the DPP won, then the Republicans won in America. And not that it's that funny to everybody, but I think it's funny. And so that's how I know the 2020 election was stolen, because the DPP won here and the Republicans didn't win in America. And it broke this pattern that was the oracle that told me which the outcome of the election was going to be. In terms of Marco Rubio, he clearly has proven to be a very influential member of the Trump cabinet. He has clearly proven to be a very credible interlocutor with a lot of world leaders in lots of major regions. The Trump administration has dealt with more significant national security challenges in more regions of the world at once than any American administration in my memory, and maybe in the history of the United States. If you just look at Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Western Hemisphere all having what would be headline full-time crisis management from a White House, that's happening all at once. While the president was in Beijing, you still had some things simmering along in Iran, but he seemed to wait. But there was still the CIA director showing up in Havana, I'm sure much to the surprise of the people of Cuba and maybe some other areas. And so there's this pace that is unbelievable, and Rubio has been seen as a reassuring and stabilizing actor in all of that. Does that mean that J.D. Vance is not first in line to be the nominee? It doesn't mean anything at this point. The first thing that has to happen is a midterm election. And then you have to see what comes out of that midterm election. President Trump is fighting against history, but he is a unique president in so many different ways. It doesn't guarantee success, but it definitely means that conventional analysis will consistently fail to guide you engaging where this is likely to go. And so if against historical trends, Republicans come out okay in the midterm election, then the early onset of lame duck status might be resisted by a president who I am sure hates with a passion the idea that he's a lame duck. And so we'll see how someone who is so actively engaged in media every day, domestic and world events every day, how does a vice president come out from under those shadows to compete for a nomination in what could be a competitive field? That's unprecedented in some ways. So let's see. But I think that J.D. Vance has respect for Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio has respect for J.D. Vance. Doesn't mean they won't compete with each other. It also doesn't mean they won't be on a joint ticket. But Republicans are not guaranteed to win in 2028. I like our chances versus the opposition because the opposition sounds great until you see who they are. Then you have a human being who becomes a candidate, and then you have a record that has to be balanced. I like our chances, but no guarantees in this kind of thing. So I will be looking first, based on my theory of the universe, of what happens in Taiwan's election in January of 2028. And if the DPP wins, then I like the Republican chances in the fall. Back to my theory going back to normal in 2028. But we shall see. But Rubio, very strong personality, very strong force. Again, I'm a partisan, so I don't expect anyone to take what I say as anything other than coming from a partisan. But you see capability across several possible powerful figures on the Republican side that could vie in 2028 or 2032. On the Democratic side, it's a little bit harder to say who are those strong personalities with a strong base of support, with a defined policy agenda that would appeal to the critical mass of the middle that has to shift for them to win. And so I like our chances, but no guarantees.
Well, uncertainty is most important characteristic of democracy, right? Okay, here, please. Yeah, 这位先，这边先，然后在前面。
Hello, Mr. Yip. My name is Chili Chan. I am from an NGO that named Taiwan Republic, which dedicated on Taiwan independence and nation building. And actually, we met last July in UCSD with Michael Chai, the former Minister of Defense. Yeah, you might remember. Okay, my question is that just as you mentioned that Taiwan has to be a part of something like a USA or what, and another thing is that a couple of days ago, President Trump said, "I am not looking to have someone go independence." And as you know that we are looking for independence, I say our NGO. But I'm not going to talk about this moment because just as what President Trump has said. But what I want to ask is that, because you said Taiwan can be a part of USA or whatever. And
I didn't say that Taiwan can be a part of the USA. I said Taiwan can be a part of a solution.
A part of a solution.
Something that we're trying to do together.
Okay, but some people now, they express they want to be a part of USA just as 51st state. And I want to know, what do you think about this? 51st state.
Yeah. I consider it a playful notion that there will be a change in the number of states. I think there's a much greater likelihood that Puerto Rico becomes a state, so that whether it's Taiwan or Canada or whatever the joke may be of the day, I think someone else is probably going to get to 51 before Taiwan does. I only say this partially in jest. I think that for Taiwan's security and also to make an important point to the world, I think that you would have a much better audience if you said, if China were to try to coerce or invade Taiwan, what it will do is go back to being a part of Japan. That will make them so ticked off. That to them is much more poisonous than the idea of becoming a 51st state of the United States. And I think that there's 0% chance of Taiwan being a state of the United States. It's just, I don't think that that is in the cards at all. But you do have a plausible case that you already have sovereign control over your territory, your people, your currency, and you're able to engage in limited by the theater, but effective diplomatic relations with the most powerful countries on the planet. And if you use what you have, in other words, you have an incredibly high GDP, you have some incredibly well-known and powerful corporations. Those corporate leaders can walk into any leadership office on the planet and they are respected. And if you use those assets in a way that make clear that you just don't want to be swallowed and coerced, then you will preserve whatever definition of independence people could come up with anyway. But I only half in jest would say, if they move against Taiwan, then the reflexive move should be then the post-World War II decision to return the territories of Imperial Japan to the ROC or otherwise go back to this is part of Japan. And Japan probably would choke on this idea too. But it has a much greater chance of being real than Taiwan being the 51st state of the United States, in my humble estimation.
Due to constraints, so maybe our last question. But in order, two. So this two.
My name is C.L. Lu. I'm a writer. There are lots of disinformation or misinformation nowadays. So some of my friends would ask me when they see some articles which made them worry. They ask me why they write this. And I say, my answer to them always, Trump is a businessman. I used to be a businessman, so I know. For a good businessman, strategically, they would have stick to their principle. And I know Trump's principle is that Taiwan is SCAR for him. In whatever case, he would not drop it. But technically, tactically, he may say time to time a bit things which a bit puzzling. That is my interpretation. I believe that if Trump stepped down and somebody from Republic become the president, that still be the case. But my question, do you agree with me? And if Democrats become a president, would that also his strategy?
Maybe you will correct the question.
Hi, Mr. Ye, I'm Professor Chen. Okay, I'm an economist, and I'm concerning the military conflict most. I went to Ukraine 3 times. So my question is concentrate on military part. When we talk about triangle relationship, can you analyze what's the difference, what's changes in military perspective among these 3 countries, United States, China, and Taiwan? Second is, I have some idea. For example, in Taiwan, we are not usually stress the productivity difference between United States and China. But around 2 or 3 years ago, we have heard the military productivity, especially in Navy, the difference is around 230 times. And also the productivity in ammunition, especially some accurate or ballistic ammunition, is also big difference. So I think, when we see Trump, for example, several years ago, Trump would say he would bomb Beijing if China tried to military threat Taiwan. But now they change a lot. I guess this is just because military power change, among these 3 sides. Second is related to Taiwan. As I know, not many United States experts think Taiwan is well prepared in military, especially in military. For example, for Kobe, in not only his book in 2021, and recently his formal or informal argument saying Taiwan's military, no matter your will, your defense will, or your preparation, or your military expense, in GDP, is not enough. So based on this situation, Taiwanese want to be confident, want to be our house, built on United States, no matter United is rock or sand. But actually, many people say we probably built our military power in the sand. I don't know. So what kind of suggestion would you to give us Taiwanese, no matter government official or just some like a scholar or social high-level people? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you guys are really challenging my aging memory on whether I can remember the different topics to try this. And I'll try to be brief. So understand that my answers are not going to be complete because of having to be short. I think that President Trump definitely is an unconventional thinker and an unconventional actor when it comes to looking at hard problems that have lasted for a long time. He also is different in that he seems to really believe that he missed assassination by a hair, by just simply turning his head just at the right time, at just the right angle. And he seems to really believe that he missed an assassination by just that much. And that changes your point of view about why am I here and what do I really care about most in doing. And his critics won't give him the grace of seeing it that way. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but they're not going to give him that grace. But if you're trying to understand him and how he thinks, ignore the critics, focus on how he thinks he's operating, and see what you can do with that. And so he looks at the Middle East was stuck in certain patterns that were going on for decades and they were not changing and they didn't seem to be getting better. People said you couldn't move our embassy to the recognized capital of Israel or it would result in World War III. He didn't believe that. He moved the embassy. It didn't result in World War III. The beginning of talk of the Middle East was you had to recognize two states and you had to have an independent Palestinian people before you could do anything else in the rest of the Middle East. He took the opposite view and got Arab states to have a form of diplomatic recognition and economic cooperation with Israel, and it flipped the script. They maintained maximum pressure on Iran while not necessarily moving on the two-state solution that we were told for generations, and he was able to change that approach. We were told that we couldn't get NATO to change the way it was approaching its collective self-defense and investment, and it was basically slow rolling. It was going to stay dependent on the threat that we were supposed to be defending against. He might have done it in an unpopular and some might say ugly way, but he got that structural change moving in a different direction. And so if you look at these different places, another area has been China-Taiwan that we have been told can't change, but it's a problem, it's a potential flashpoint. Why should we live forever with circumstances that leave us potentially having to send lots of material, maybe lots of American personnel to defend someplace that's far away? And so that's where the restrainer argument starts to come in. Now, there are some facts that are changing that gets at what's changed in warfare that maybe can change the way people think. If people in Taiwan do deep research on what the realities are of how Ukraine has survived for more than 4 years and how they have adapted to different forms of warfare, how they've adapted to unique supply chain challenges, there are some things that could be translatable lessons for Taiwan. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't take care of all the problems. China is not Russia. China, because of all this investment in material, it has a lot more drones. It has a lot more ships. It has a lot more planes. Now, they have a quality control problem. They have not actually sent these things out into combat. Their personnel have not been involved in combat. And there is no question that should they provoke this kind of fight, they will experience casualty rates and they will experience degradation of their systems that is way beyond anything that they imagine. Doesn't mean it will be easy for us, but they will experience a bloodbath. They will lose trillions of dollars that they have invested probably in the first week of any reasonable conflict because they've invested in heavy material things that will go down very quickly upon conflict. Some will still hit Taiwan. Look at how many times Ukraine has been hit. Look how many times Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Israel were fired upon in this recent conflict. Taiwan and Japan and the United States would face more in terms of quantity from China, but we have been investing in the capabilities to defeat the more expensive attack with more agile and less expensive defense capabilities. The more we expand that kind of cooperation, that kind of investment, that kind of supply chain, that's why it is absolutely vital, why at a fundamental level it disgusts me what the opposition party did on the special budget in Taiwan, because what it did was it killed the single most important part of that investment that makes Taiwan more flexible and more resilient in a time of crisis, also less dependent on the United States, still can be a purchaser from the United States, still can be a friend with the United States, but the most important part is that indigenous capability. And who benefits most of all from that indigenous capability being halted? China does. And it's toxic for Taiwan's relationship with the United States because it makes it look like, cynically, you're prepared to buy weapon systems because you think that our defense industries will lobby our governments and that's how you'll keep the American commitment. But that is not where our politics are now, and I think that crosses parties. And so I hope that Americans and others can wise up to what the political game was here and put pressure where pressure deserves to go, because that indigenous development is very, very vital. And I think it's a shared interest beyond Taiwan and in other parts of this region and in other regions. And where we are successfully rebalancing alliances in the broader Middle East and some other areas, it's where they have strong indigenous capabilities and where we can share technology, where we can share manufacturing, where they are presenting value to our supply chains and we're presenting value in terms of capability that we sell to them, not give to them. And that is a more resilient relationship. It's not junior partner, senior partner, big brother, little brother. It's more of a mature partnership. And so America will still be big, and you probably will still be dependent in some areas, but the trend line can move in these ways if we get the politics right and we get those supply chains right. But that indigenous part, I think, is incredibly important. If the KMT leader is going to America, as I hear, I strongly suspect that she's about to get a pretty full-throated version of what I just told you. Because American leaders right now are not really interested in what your political competition is inside Taiwan. They are very, very seized with the idea that broader deterrence against Beijing adventurism is strengthened, and that burden is shared fairly, where each is giving what they can to that contribution. And what they just did, she's not going to get credit for buying American. She's going to get criticized for pulling down the indigenous capability that would actually make it so that Americans wouldn't have to bear the brunt of this. Last, I would just say on the individual part, for most of my life, people have said, we're not going to send our sons and daughters to bleed for the Taiwanese people if they're not prepared to fight for themselves. I think that there's been progress in civil awareness and civil defense in Taiwan in recent years. I think the whole of nation resiliency movement is a positive development. And I hope it's something that's built upon and is broadly shared, ideally across parties. But in the modern kind of warfare that we're facing now, Americans are not going to set foot in Taiwan any more than Americans really didn't set foot in Iran. This is going to be a war at distance, if it's a war at all. It's going to be a clash of technologies and many, many unmanned systems before that there are large numbers of American soldiers that are put in harm's way. And I guarantee there will be more Taiwanese that are put at risk before there are Americans put at risk in that. And you can still keep your security under those terms of engagement. So I hope those are some quickly delivered but still useful things to ponder. I don't claim to be right about all these things, and I don't pretend that I will have converted you all to the way I think, but I am grateful that you gave the time and the interest, and I am deeply, deeply grateful that my life has been blessed with many decades of friendly conversations like this, and I hope that we continue in the future.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks TIA for hosting this event. Do you have anything? Oh, okay. So the most important. Okay. So after standing photo. So you have a blue and green mic.